So I'm in Jerusalem studying the Hebrew scriptures and minding my own business, watching these fathers everywhere have lots of kids. Israel, is famously the only developed nation in the world with above replacement fertility rate, and you can see why. It's because these dads are being deeply influenced by their faith in a unique way that we're not. So, I was one day I was just sitting on a bench and I watched 3 or 4 dads pushing strollers with all these little kids in tow, and I just remember seeing that scene and I was like, that's the weirdest thing I've ever seen. I mean, I've seen like mommy brigades before. I had never seen a daddy brigade. And it's sort of like what was the first time the thought entered my consciousness. Like, what do these dads believe about fatherhood, family that I don't believe? Because I don't like when I see that scene, I'm like, that'll never be me. But I can't necessarily then make the corresponding boast that and look at the amazing life I'm going to lead or the incredible families that come
Yeah.
out of the culture I'm from. Like I sort of had this moment of like just realization and kind of humility, like maybe our culture's got something wrong. So I started asking these Jewish fathers in particular, and even some of the Arab fathers, like describe how you see family, like, and can you explain to me why men want to have like kids, large families that and really almost see their identity through fatherhood. I don't where does this come from? And
That was a
over and
great
over again,
question.
they were giving me the same answer, the same one-word answer, Abraham, Abraham, Abraham. I'm like, Abraham?
Wow.
That guy in the guy that like the camel trader in the Old Testament, like guy that,
Yeah.
yeah, like that guy? Yes, like that's like, okay, you're gonna have to because one of the weird parts of my story was I actually was studying with I would say the premier evangelical Abrahamic scholar, and his name is John Sailhammer. I was in a tiny class with just 8 of us, and Sailhammer's his whole kind of claim to fame. He wrote a book called The Pentateuch as a Narrative, is that you can understand the Torah, the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. You'll understand it best if you actually read it through 2 lenses, 2 biographies, Abraham and Moses. And he said that the
Huh.
way that the New Testament authors read the Torah was through the lens of Abraham. And so I was in this tiny class, and it was a very advanced class in a graduate school studying the Torah through the lens of Abraham. And so I
Wow.
was obsessed with Abraham before going to Israel, but never once did we have a conversation about Abraham as father. And this is weird. I mean, because here I am now in the Middle East, and it seems like it's like a veil over our eyes. We don't see Abraham as a father, but even when Jesus referred to Abraham, right, in the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, he calls him Father Abraham. Like everyone in this culture in the Middle East, they see Abraham and they always hear the word father. Now, part of this is a linguistic problem that we have. I would say we have a linguistic problem and we have a literary, like, interpretive problem. So the linguistic problem is we don't hear the word father every time we say Abraham. And in Hebrew, the word for father is av, right? And the word for daddy is abba. But av is the word for father. And so when you hear Avram, Avram means exalted father. That was Abraham's original name.
Fascinating.
Or Avraham is the father of many nations. And so they it's important to understand Abraham is not just a person, he is a symbol in the book of Genesis. He is a prophetic symbol of fatherhood. Now, Muslims understand this and Jews understand this, but Christians, we don't, and this gets to the second problem. We have kind of a literary lens that we read the Bible through, which is a sort of a modern historical lens where we see history where there's really symbol, theological symbol. And it
Hmm.
doesn't mean these things didn't historically happen. It's just that these are symbols. In the New Testament, the Jesus was constantly talking about the person of Elijah, and Jesus says this bizarre thing in Matthew 16. The disciples are always asking him, "What about Elijah? What is Elijah?" And then Jesus says this thing that Elijah has come, Elijah has come in this generation, and Elijah will come. And every historical like Christian like scratches their head and saying, "What the heck is Jesus talking about?" But they knew what he was talking about. Elijah is a
Yeah.
spirit. We read about that in Malachi. So this is Elijah is a prophetic symbol of something. He's also a historical character, but primarily we understand the reason why these particular historical narratives are preserved about Elijah is to give power to this symbol of Elijah, the essence of Elijah, the prophetic meaning of Elijah. This is the whole way the Old Testament is written. Well, one of the ways that we know this is in the Jewish Bible. There are only three sections. In the Christian Bible, there are 4 sections, right? So in the Christian Bible, we have the Pentateuch, which is the first 5 books. We have the historical books, right, that are Joshua through Second Chronicles. We have kind of we call the wisdom literature, right? That starts with Job and ends with like I can't remember if it's like Lamentations or I think it ends with like Ecclesiastes, and then we have the prophets, right, which are kind of Isaiah all the way through Malachi. That is not the
Yeah.
way that Jews read the Old Testament, but they read it as the Tanakh, the Torah, the Nevi'im, the Ketuvim. So the Tanakh is actually acrostic. In other words, there's something missing. We've added a fourth category that doesn't exist in the Jewish Bible. We've added this thing called the historical books, right? And so Joshua was not considered a historical book. It's not listed under the historical books. There's no list of historical books in the Jewish Bible. The Tanakh, it's listed as a prophet. It's part of prophecy. And this is a massive confusion. And this is why, like, we just completely misinterpret
Hmm.
historical narratives. Every time a Christian reads First and Second Samuel, you're not about David, about Saul. You're reading patterns of like prophetic patterns about how things work. The reason why in the book of Revelation Jesus says you have a Jezebel, it's not saying somehow this woman Jezebel was resurrected and was a part of a church. No, no, no. Jezebel is a spirit, is a prophetic pattern that recurs throughout history. And so yes, Jezebel was a historical character at one time, but through prophecy, through the writing of prophecy, as we read about in the New Testament, Peter says that a prophet is carried along by the Holy Spirit while he's writing. And so he's
Yes.
writing the words of God in that sense. Well, what the prophets are doing in First and Second Kings when they're writing about Jezebel, Elijah, all these characters, they're being carried along by the Holy Spirit, and they're giving us prophetic patterns of how things recur in every generation, in all kinds of situations. So Abraham himself is not just a historical character. Avram, the exalted father, the model father, is a perfect Holy Spirit inspired depiction of how God himself interacts with the category of fatherhood. And so we constantly are midrashing Genesis 12, 13, 14, 15. And every time we do this, I'm just like getting overwhelmed with the amount of Holy Spirit inspired content that is shaping this sort of bucket called fatherhood. And
Hmm.
and this is the way that Arabs have in the Quran. There are very different narratives about Abraham, but they have it in a very similar category. I don't believe in those Abrahamic narratives that are in the Quran. I think that they're from the enemy. They're not from the Lord, but they are influenced in a similar way. The Jews today are influenced by the exact same narratives that we have, of course, in our Hebrew scriptures. They're reading the book of Genesis just the way we do, but they're interpreting it in a very different lens. And so did the rabbis. The rabbis understood this about the nature of all the characters in the Old Testament, as did all the New Testament authors. The people who don't get this today are modern Christians. We are clueless, and what happens is it leaves us without Holy Spirit inspired content for defining this thing called fatherhood or this thing called family. That's just one of the massive consequences of this
Okay.
problem.